We're calling the house into order, so hope you had your lunch already. We understand that some of you might be feeling a bit sleepy from all those foods you've eaten. So I think Tia would start us with an exercise. No, just okay. So welcome to session 2A. This is on climate change adaptation and resilience. It's still part of the blue-green economy stream or part of the theme of our blue-green economy. So Tia has extensive experience working for the government of Kiribati and for some of the development partners. I think for the people on the table, most of them would have been a colleague of Tia except for Kaya. She's been with the IMF and the World Bank ADB Joint Liaison Officer. She's currently engaged as a strategic program for climate resilience secretariat coordinator funded by ADB and based at the Pacific Islands Foreign Secretariat. So to chair this session, I give you the lovely Tia Tira.
Oh, thank you. I think everyone's still digesting lunch. Thank you very much, Prince, for that introduction. And as had been said, this session is about climate change, adaptation, and resilience. I have 4 panelists in front of you today, and we should start going into the substance of this session. So I would like to introduce Tobagas. Tobagas is currently the resident representative of the International Monetary Fund based in Suva, and he's been in the Pacific since September 2014. And I will now pass on to Tobagas to take us through his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tia. Bula Binaka, and good afternoon to everyone. It's good to be here. I was here last year during the Pacific conference, and it's good to be back here again. The topic that was asked for me to present is the results of the Pacific Island workshop and the high-level dialogue that was done in Suva in April. And that was in collaborations between the IMF, ADB, and JICA, and Fiji government. And I'm going to describe what they are, and then the outcome or the key takeaways from the meetings that we had in Suva in April. Let me start by my presentation to discuss a little bit of the content. So we have the 2 events in April. The first one was the workshop. This is for the mid-level officials and the IMF and ADB and JICA and the World Bank staff working together. The second one is the high-level dialogue in which the ministers and the central bank governors and the permanent secretaries are coming, and we have one full day of a dialogue on a building resilience to climate change. As I mentioned before, the events were co-hosted by the IMF, the Fiji government, with the funding support from ADB, JICA, and the IMF. And I will describe the objectives, and then I will describe the main takeaways of the 2 events. The mid-level workshop took place in April 4 to 6 in Suva, in Fiji. And as in general, the events, both the workshop and the high-level dialogue, is to build resilience, to strengthen macroeconomic policies, to improve economic resilience in addressing climate change, And in the workshop, it's basically focusing on the capacity building. So how do we strengthen macroeconomic policies, and how to incorporate those climate change challenges in making the policies so that the economic resilience can be strengthened. So it facilitates engagement between the IMF mission teams and other development partners, other ADBs and JICA and the World Bank staffs, with the Pacific Island officials at the mid-level official. This is the budget director, the planning director, and this is beyond the regular IMF missions in the Pacific, beyond the annual and spring meetings, beyond the conference like this. It's a special event in which the IMF staff and ADB and the World Bank and JICA work together with the authorities at the mid-level levels, mid-levels officials, in which they are doing the number crunching for the budget and how to discuss the climate change and natural disaster and how to improve policies. It was well attended by about 50 participants, mainly officials responsible for the medium-term budget framework and also in the planning agencies from all economies in the Pacific. We have 15, 16 countries coming over. The workshop was interactive, 3 days, and it strengthened the links between policy advice, policy formulation, and then capacity building. So the sessions of the workshop, there are several sessions depending on the focus. Of course, the first one is we have to cover the big picture, how the macroeconomic approach to address natural disasters and climate change. And then how do we develop the fiscal responses? Why fiscal? Because those are most Pacific Island countries still rely so much on the fiscal policies and not on the monetary policies. And even some countries don't even have the monetary policy. So fiscal is still #1 priorities. So, and then how do we build economic resilience in the country using fiscal responses? And then what's the role of the public investment, especially on the infrastructure? And how is the access to financing options that are available for the Pacific and the instruments? So those are the topics that were covered during the workshop. So there are 3 main kind of tools or topics in which the officials discuss with the staff of the development partners and the IMF. The first is the medium-term budget framework, in which the workshop try to work together on how to develop the budget, not only for 1 or 2 years, but maybe 5, 6 years down the road. So it's a medium-term budget framework. So how do we introduce a multi-year spending, prioritization of expenditure, how to control spending, which one to focus, and so on. So the key here is not only thinking about the budget of 1 or 2 years, but it's a longer term. So this is a useful tool. It's very useful in which the budget planning officers can work together with the policymakers in the country levels. And then the second topics that we discuss is the policy options. Let's say we want to raise revenue. How are we going to raise revenue? If we want to control spending or to prioritize spending, where to go and how much, and how do we balance between, let's say, social spending and infrastructure, and then how much should we build the fiscal buffers, how to achieve the target. So all these fiscal policy options were discussed during the workshop. And finally, how the sustainability of the debt. The country's debt sustainability was analyzed. So how different scenarios matters. Should we borrow from should we improve resilience by external borrowing, or and then what kind of mix should we borrow? Should we go to the insurance? Should we prioritize grants, and how will it affect the debt sustainability? What kind of interest rate? What kind of the terms of the borrowing? And those are the type of the exercise that was done during the workshop. So what are the key takeaways? Okay. The first one that we found out during the workshop was that the importance of asset registers. It's a critical requirement, not only listing the asset of the building or bridge or the roads, but also identifying the conditions so that they can be properly maintained and the policy design can be properly design or build to exactly know, how much is the resources needed depending on the quality of the asset. So it's not only important to list the asset, but also the quality of the asset, the conditions of the asset. And then the second thing that we found out is that the maintenance costs, so let's say, we're building a new school or new roads, the maintenance costs of this new school or new roads are not always incorporated in the budget. So, but down the road, when there is some resources needed for maintenance of this new building, there is no resources. There is nothing in the budget for this maintenance, and then the asset quality deteriorates very, very quickly. So this maintenance cost is not always included in the budget, and the lessons that we found out during the workshop is that this should be part of the medium-term budget. So when the budget officials plan the budget for next year, there have to be some linkage between the capital spending, how to spend the money to build the road or to build the school, and then how much is the cost that should be incorporated in the current spending for 5 years down the road. If there is, for example, there is no domestic resources, then the country will have to get the external resources also to maintain the building. So that's the second lesson that we learned from the workshop. And then the third lessons that we also discovered was that mainstreaming climate change actions in development planning and reflecting into national policy and sector program. This has been done, in many countries to put the, climate change strategy into the national development planning, or maybe a special, paper, special action related to climate change and how to build a climate change resilience. But how to put these priority actions or the plans into the budget has lagged behind. So it is important how to translate all of these plans into the mainstream, to do it within the budget framework. And then the other lessons that we learned, or the key takeaways from the workshop, is that we need to make sure that investments generate returns that are higher than the cost, including the opportunity cost, and the planning and implementation are critical. And then we did the simulations, in terms of the financing option for the governments. There are basically three possibilities, right? The first one is building up reserves, fiscal buffers, or contingency credits, tapping up some available credits from development partners, or participate in the insurance scheme, in which you transfer the risk through the insurance scheme, insurance program. And then finally, there is a need to do a proactive approach to secure political commitments from the top leaderships of the country into the medium-term budget framework. So those are the key takeaways from the workshop, 3-day workshop exercise with the officials from the Pacific. This is just photos of the workshop in which each of the country participants, did the exercise together with the IMF, World Bank, and JICA, and the staff and ADB staff, and then they did a presentation, what's their finding, and hopefully they could bring this, tools or framework back to the country, so that when they develop the budget framework, they can apply what was learned during the workshop. This is the participants. So we had 50 people participate in the workshop. Now let's move quickly to the high-level dialogue. This took place on April 7, this one day. The objective is providing a platform to discuss policies in addressing natural disaster and climate change. So we are focusing on policies. The workshop focus was on the tools, that can be used for planning the budget. This one is the high-level dialogue focuses on the policies. So it focused on the policy formulations and design issues, and the discussion were organized as a series of panel discussions, involving mostly the ministers, from all Pacific Island countries, and then moderators, of course, and then Q&A after that. The Prime Minister of Fiji opened the conference provided the keynote address, and then also the senior officials, the vice presidents of JICA and also ADB Director General also participated in closing the sessions. About 120 participants, Ministry of Finance, Permanent Secretary, Central Bank Governors, workshop participants, and all development partners. It's a big event. So there are three panels. The first one focuses on the investment, in the disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. The second one is on the public finance management and the debt sustainability. The third one is on the financing side. What are the options and what are the obstacles in terms of the climate change financing? Let me move quickly on the takeaways. Let me focus on the first one, the high-level dialogue, the first panel, which is on the investment in disaster risk reduction. The first one is that the building resilience to natural disaster is also important for sustaining growth. There was some discussion, should there be a trade-off between growth and building fiscal buffer, for example? And the answer is no, because by improving the resilience, the countries can prevent the dip, prevent the contractions of the economic growth during the disaster. And by doing that, the economic resilience will improve. So it's not necessarily a trade-off. 1 minute? Wow, okay. Okay, then, the second one is on the, okay, I will just read them. The long run focus on the building resilience, the focus is on long run building resilience, but in the immediate aftermath, there is always a trade-off between which sectors or which priorities needs to be focused on. And that's the issue that the policymakers have to deal with. And there is also a difficult to build hardcore resilience in the Pacific because there is a trade-off between a social, need, social spending on education and health versus the infrastructure development. So there's always a difficult balance that we need to maintain. And finally, partnering with the private sector is important because low insurance coverage in the Pacific Island countries, then the government will have to rely on the private sector. So that is something that was the key takeaways of the first panel. Okay. The organizer will have my presentation, so you can walk through. And the second one is the public financial PFM and the debt sustainability. The first one is that the external funded project tend to set a high standard in linking the building resilience. And as a result, project implementation is always, well, not always, but it's often it's a challenge because, institutional capacity. And then the second one is that the building economic resilience and ensuring debt sustainability are complementary. Again, it's not a trade-off. And the DSA framework that is currently being done by the IMF and the World Bank is still being revised to review to incorporate national disasters. And then any project financed the government assistance must be country-born, country-led, and implemented using the country systems. And the availability of in-country funding is also important. And then finally, the Pacific Islands should explore alternative instruments, such as buffers on contingent credit line, like facilities from development partners. And in managing the PFM and fiscal buffers, countries should continue what kind of priorities and what kind of hazard or risks, highest risk that they have to address. Finally, this is my final slides on the panel 3. The first one is that securing climate change financing is a challenge for the Pacific Island countries because of the capacity constraint, and that's why climate change financing needs to be less bureaucratic. The domestic resource mobilization is also important. Without domestic financing, it will be harder to access external financings. And country authorities need to build ownerships to keep the development partners involved. So the country authorities needs to be the driver. Partnership with the civil society has also been useful. And working together as a region, through a well-coordinated approach is also go a long way in improving resilience. And finally, it's important to look at the ex-ante implication of project financing. In this context, if I have to mention one important point in terms of this climate change resilience, is basically improving the PFM and the multi-medium-term budget framework, multi-year budget framework. Those are the main key. If I have to say one important thing from the outcome, is that PFM and the multi-year budget framework. And this is just the photos from the high-level conference. We had about 140, 130 people came, and it was a huge event. Thank you. Sorry, running a little bit late.
Thank you very much, and please round of applause for Tobagus. I think it was quite a challenge, 15 minutes to put into context the macroeconomic policies, especially fiscal responses. I would now like to introduce our next speaker. David brings to the region 16 years of experience in engineering design and project management, especially large-scale transport infrastructure projects. He's currently based in the ADB office in Suva, and I give the floor to David. Remember the time management?
Okay, yes, thanks, Tia. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon, and thank you to the event organisers to have me. I feel very honoured to be able to rub shoulders with the intellect that this forum attracts, and I hope I leave you as enthusiastic with this study as I am myself. For the PRIF, for those who are not familiar, this initiative started in 2009. The purpose is to improve the quality of infrastructure in our Pacific Island countries. It does this by coordinating development partners, providing technical assistance, and by coordinating and directing research. PRIF has 7 donors, and as such represents most of the major development partners who are active in our region. PRIF working sector groups are made up of staff, technical staff from each of our partner institutions. They meet 3 to 4 times a year to discuss project opportunities, project pipelines, and to identify best practices and how they can be utilised and adapted for application in the Pacific. In 2015, the Transport Sector Working Group gathered, and there was a long and considered discussion on coastal protection. I think it was the World Bank who actually came to the table and said, there's a great opportunity. We have been doing much work in the Pacific, and we have really need to step up and improve our performance with regard to coastal protection. So they launched this study. The question is why? There's 2 important answers to that. Obviously, the land and sea interface is where much valuable road, maritime and air infrastructure exists, and where we lose shoreline materials and where that intersects with this infrastructure, our countries are suffering significant economic costs. So at the front end of the design process, we need to make sure that we take all of this into consideration and design accordingly. Now, there's also a political element here. Dame Meg Taylor this morning mentioned fragile countries. She brought up the concept that there's a definition change happening internationally. Previously, it has been about post-conflict states. Now, there's more recognition that climate susceptibility and vulnerability to the risks borne by climate change are bringing into the market, the funding market, greater funding opportunities. So for me, in that context of Dame Meg's observation, I thought before I talk about the study, I would talk about what has been done on coastal protection so far. The UNDP, not a member of PRIF, unfortunately, they are leading this charge. They have embraced the susceptibility argument, and they put a very convincing proposal to the Green Climate Fund and secured $39 million of grant money for a project in Tuvalu. Now, this is a staggering amount of money for such a small country, but that shows the power of the political shift, and it really illustrates why I've been invited to come and talk today, because there is an opportunity for all the Pacific countries to take part in this, to promote your country's needs and to make sure that you get your share of the funding pie that is being made available. Sorry, I must go back. I've forgotten to mention what the other development partners have done. World Bank are looking to implement a project in Marshall Islands on coastal protection. The Asian Development Bank are implementing a climate resilience sector project in Tonga. And with this continued focus and also the success enjoyed by the UNDP, they are also positioning Tonga to apply for another $60 million grant at the end of this year for a very significant project in Tongatapu. So onto the study, why I've been invited to talk. Okay, so there are a range of measures that can be used to mitigate erosion. The most attractive, of course, is to avoid the need altogether. Don't build roads, don't build your house, don't build valuable infrastructure on the coast. Unfortunately, where land availability is limited and there are existing structures in play, obviously we must protect those. In that challenge, there's obviously a few other obstacles. Our countries in the Pacific don't all have good materials. There's only a few that have got good quality quarries from which we extract materials, mostly for roads. But these are also called upon to provide rock material for sea armour walls and the like. So unfortunately, most of our countries don't have them, and then for those that don't, the costs of importing them are prohibitive. So it was in this context that this study commenced. Okay, so non-engineered solutions have been trialled in this region for many years with various success. They've included gabion baskets, sand cement bags, stacked coral rock, cemented coral rock, concrete filled barrels and pipes, and other materials of opportunity. When you're trying to protect your valuable structure and your livelihood, you embrace whatever materials you can get your hands on. Across the Pacific Island countries, we know that materials consistent with the existing design guidelines are not available, and it is in this light that the scope for an innovative use of locally available materials exists, and this, of course, is the focus of this study. So, to the objectives, there's been plenty done, so we just needed to collate and build on existing knowledge. we wanted to find erosion protection solutions that maximise the use of local materials and labour, and of course to minimise the prohibitive costs of imported materials and equipment. So the study involved 3 phases. Throughout the 3 phases, the study identified the countries with material supply problems. It catalogued existing non-engineered solutions. It critically evaluated these approaches using a multi-criteria analysis, and it provided recommendations for the improvement of existing structures. So, importantly, preferred solutions were based upon modelling, and there was field testing to verify these findings. So I won't read to you long lengths on this multi-criteria analysis, but there was 3 points. The technical criteria considered primarily cost and effectiveness to protect, and then this was blended with other social and environmental criteria. Note please that this first phase provided indicative costing for coastal protection solutions, and it provides the novice designer a very valuable tool to consider a particular site and to better understand the likely costs and the likely performance differences between the different solutions. So, to test the adequacy of our study, the University of New South Wales conducted some hydraulic testing. You'll see here, this is a 1:7.5 scale model. The one on the left tested geotextile baskets, a very heavily woven synthetic fabric. It's very durable. And then the other, on the right-hand side, is concrete block work, the typical type of concrete blocks that would be used in housing construction. Sorry, I've lost my place here. So here we come. This is the golden offering of this particular study. This design guidance manual provides the reader with due diligence strategies to investigate the needs and to address the requirements that need to be designed to. So a draft of this manual will be presented on a webinar on Monday next week at 12 o'clock Suva time. If you would like to be involved in this webinar, please tell me. I will send you the link details. I would encourage anybody involved in coastal protection to actually become involved with this. The great value, of course, is the costing information, the standard design drawings, and importantly, lots and lots of terms of reference with regard to how to do set-outs and survey each individual scene. So the content of this report will be finalised by the 30th of June, and this will also be on the Proof website by early August. So stage 3 involves a field verification pilot. They will take the design manual and they will test 100-metre sections. They will probably use, most likely, the concrete blocks. We're looking to the World Bank to provide us an entry on Martian Islands. We're also looking to the Asian Development Bank to have a discussion with the Tonga government for a test pilot on northeast Tongatapu. once we actually implement these projects, the PRIF will provide plenty of support thereafter on a monitoring and evaluation, and it will all be about dissemination thereafter. So today I'm here to ask you to help me to disseminate this. This is valuable intellectual offering, and with more knowledge and more dissemination, obviously, the efforts that have been put to date will deliver even greater benefits. So it's at this stage that I will be a little bit naughty. A few days ago, I was approached by some friends of mine from JICA. I'll ask Obasan to put his hand up now. Okay. Obasan will be at the back of the auditorium when this session finishes. To this very narrow focus of coastal protection that the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank and most other development partners focus on, there are also other projects that look to the social elements and really focus on the beach and the protection of the beach in the context of important cultural factors and the projects as a tool for the mobilisation of people. In Tuvalu, sorry Obasan, I've got the wrong... Look, let me tell you, this project that JICA are putting together in Tuvalu, there is a 200-metre long beach. The width of the beach is about 25 metres. At two ends, there's two groins, 100 metres long. I had a wonderful photo here that I don't have now. The beach is a real focal point for the community, and JICA have done a fantastic effort in developing this project. They will be presenting a guideline, a design guideline in December 2017, and in the absence of the overhead material, I would encourage all people to collect a small handout at the door on your departure. So look, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and I'll see you over the next 2 days.
Thank you very much, David. And it's good to hear that though there's some trials on engineering coastal protection, there's also a look at the opportunities to look at social and cultural factors towards how to protect our coastline. I now turn to the next speaker, who is Scott from the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. Scott is the Economic Infrastructure Advisor, and he works on infrastructure policy and improving access to climate change finance for the Pacific Island countries. And I give Scott the floor.
Thanks very much, Tia, and thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to my esteemed panel colleagues as well. And I'd like to be able to thank the organisers and the sponsors of this meeting for the opportunity to be invited here and to speak this afternoon. So as Tia said, in terms of our focus here, I'm looking at the framework for resilient development in the Pacific, which is a new strategy which has just recently been endorsed by leaders. I guess before I start my discussion about the presentation, the decision by leaders and the details of the FRDP, I just wanted to, I guess, highlight the importance of the meeting last year in Ponape, where the forum leaders reaffirmed that climate change and disaster risk management will remain a top priority for the region, not only for this year and next year, but most highly likely into the medium term. This is important as we are dealing with the challenges of a full agenda for leaders and for member countries, And this has obviously been increasingly being filled with a range of diverse political, social and economic challenges that we face. And obviously we can see that from the agenda that we have at this very important meeting. If there is one key message from the FRDP, it's about the need to be able to build resilience for the Pacific and the need to incorporate climate change and disaster risk management into the development discourse. So this has been a long journey, and I know that that there have been many national and regional champions of this work in the Pacific. I know I can only express my personal enthusiasm and support for this, that we're now able to go past the policy work and now start progress towards the implementation. So overall, 2015 and 2016 have been very critical years for multilateralism. It was a very successful demonstration that nations can work together in terms of the outcomes if we look towards the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also, of course, the Paris Agreement. And also should mention the Samoa Pathway as well. In line with these developments, leaders in 2016 endorsed the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific and recognised its potential to support coordination and action on a number of key issues related to supporting national implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, in addition to their low carbon development pathways identified often through their nationally determined contributions. Leaders also agreed to the Pohnpei Statement for strengthening Pacific resilience to climate change and disaster risks, although I won't bore you with the details of that, but it does complement the FRDP, and it is part of the Leaders' Declaration that was made last year. The main thing with regard to the Leaders' decision was that they tasked the Forum Secretariat to convene a working group to elaborate on the Pacific Resilience Partnership process, which is meant to be able to support the implementation of the FRDP. So in terms of the leaders' specific decision, they endorsed the Framework for Resilient Development. They agreed for it to be fully elaborated and operationalised upon the entry into force in Paris, which occurred on the 5th of October and then came into operation on the 5th of November, and recognised its potential to support coordination and action in a number of key issues related to climate change and disaster risk management. So we should not underplay what means or ignore the role that the Pacific has played, obviously, with regard to not only the early ratification of the Paris Agreement, but also the fact is that when we look in the wider scale of things, it did take the Kyoto Protocol 8 years to be able to get enough countries and enough proportion of emissions to be able to basically get over the line to come into force. So what does the FRDP replace? The framework we're discussing today did start out with a vision, and it is satisfying to become a reality. In 2012, the Pacific Island Forum leaders again decided that they wanted to support the development of a single integrated regional strategy on climate change and disaster risk management to succeed the previous two separate strategy frameworks. So these are the Pacific Islands Framework for Action on Climate Change and the Pacific Disaster Management Framework for Action. And so unfortunately we have a little movement where they come together, and so we can move on to that. Now, the substantive work on the formulation of the new strategy was initiated after the first joint meeting of the Pacific Climate Change Roundtable and Pacific Platform Disaster Risk Management, and that took place in 2013. The development of the strategy was led by a steering committee that was supported by a technical working group. That steering committee had representatives from member countries, from non-state actors, from the private sector, and as I said, supported by a group that was a technical working group consisting of representatives from the SPC, SPREP, USP, UNISDR, UNDP, and the Forum Secretariat. So the development of the FRDP also occurred over several years and was made possible through the provision of funding support, in particular from the European Union, the Australian Government, the Government of Sweden, the Government of Japan, and United States Agency for International Development, USAID. So I'd like to be able to thank their support for that. So what is the FRDP in terms of what it's meant to do? Sorry for that. So what is the FRDP? When we speak of resilience and supporting sustainable development, there are some important points to understand about the FRDP. The FRDP is a voluntary set of guidelines. It's a regional framework that supports the implementation of national strategies and plans, but does not replace them. It is a non-political policy document, and it's non-prescriptive in terms of regarding the position that countries might take at international negotiations. And finally, it's a living document. That means that it will be regularly revised to incorporate the needs of Pacific Island countries and territories. The FRDP provides coordinated and integrated priorities for the regional, national, community levels that is embedded in sustainable development, leading to resilient development outcomes. Climate change, as I said, and disaster risk management, as I stated before, are no longer specific sector challenges, but a core part of the development planning discourse that we need to be part of. In terms of the specific vision of the FRDP, we see that it has a vision that aspires for the Pacific people, societies, economies, culture, and natural environments to be resilient to changing conditions and extreme events resulting from climate change, climate variability, geological processes to enhance the well-being of our people to promote sustainable development. There are 3 goals within the FRDP. The first one is strengthen integrated adaptation and risk reduction to enhance resilience to climate change. This is about managing risks and improving the efficiency of resource management. The second, dealing with low carbon development, is about reducing carbon intensity, the efficiency of energy consumption, the efficient use of energy resources, and also the resilience of energy infrastructure. Finally, the last one is dealing with strengthened disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and that deals with the preparation and the post, improving the efficiency of preparation, but also in terms of being able to improve the rapidness of support and response. So the key messages of the FRDP basically mean that the overall message of the FRDP is to enhance resilience to climate change and disasters in ways that contribute to and are embedded in sustainable development. The framework is not just providing direction to climate change and disaster communities, projects or programs. Rather, it presents a holistic guidance about ensuring that the actions we take are also embedded in sustainable development and poverty alleviation. And just as a quick aside, last week I was actually presenting the framework to the PRIF Management Committee last week. And this is part of the wider process of advocacy related to the FRDP. So the FRDP advocates 2 types of integration. First of all, integrated actions to address climate change and disasters wherever possible. There is a large overlap, not complete, but there is a large overlap amongst the areas. So this guidance recognises that overlap between them and looks at the similar tools used for resources required to monitor, analyse, address climate and disaster risks. Many Pacific Island countries and territories have already taken concrete steps to manage these risks in an integrated manner. So the FRDP is not leading the way, it's basically coming from a regional level in terms of supporting existing work already happening in many countries in the region. Secondly, in terms of the FRDP advocates more effective mainstreaming of actions to address climate change and disaster risks into development planning, including policy making, planning, financing, programming and implementation. This is action around a particular range of areas which is identified in the publication itself. Because climate change and disaster risks are cross-cutting, and so action must take place at the sectoral level and across a range of different areas normally considered outside of disaster risk and climate change. It's essential that mainstream actions build resilience into development sectors such as health, education, water, sanitation, agriculture. And David, in his previous presentation, highlighted an important one with regard to coastal infrastructure. The FRDP takes an all-stakeholder approach to building resilience as everyone's business. It's not just resting with particular development partners, it's not resting with countries, it's not resting with regional organisations, it's resting with all of us to be able to work together and cooperatively on this issue. The FRDP also advocates a human rights approach in all actions to build resilience. A guiding principle of the framework ensures that protection of human rights such as right to life, safety, dignity, non-discrimination and access to basic necessities so that every person has equitable access to humanitarian development assistance according to his or her specific needs. The FRDP also aims for a systematic adoption of inclusive and participative processes which should not only gather contributions across different stakeholder groups but also ensure that the most vulnerable are considered as key stakeholders to be able to participate in all actions as actors for building resilience. National and regional resilience starts with empowering all persons within communities to respond to disasters and climate change, including those that are most vulnerable, for example, women, children, older persons, and persons with physical and mental disabilities. The FRDP provides guidance to small island developing states that need to be supported in building resilience to natural hazards and the effects of climate change, particularly through finance, technology transfer and capacity building from developed countries and development partners tailored to their needs and priorities as identified by them. Important and ongoing future work on loss and damage, the importance of dealing with human displacement caused by climate change, and the further development of disaster risk insurance for the Pacific are all included in the document and identified as priorities. The framework is also closely aligned to implementing the global agreements such as the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, the Samoa Pathway, Sustainable Development Agenda, and the World Humanitarian Summit as part of this work going forward. And it aims not to duplicate the work for countries, but aims to be able to utilise those existing reporting mechanisms that have been utilised. Last week there was a major conference on the SDGs and the measurement and assessment of those SDGs going forward. And that's part of the process where we're working very closely to ensure that we don't duplicate nor provide additional burden to our member countries. To implement the process going forward, there's a proposal to create what's known as the Pacific Resilience Partnership as a regional governance structure to support the implementation of the FRDP. This will facilitate different stakeholder groups, communities of practice working on climate change, disaster risk, sustainable development, finance, planning, etc., such as and low carbon development to work together, share experiences, but also promote better regional coordination, support the implementation of the FRDP through and improve monitoring coordinations and also communications and also regional meetings. The group has met twice this year. The first meeting was in early February, the second meeting was in May, and basically the group consisting of a wide variety of countries, crop organisations and stakeholders has come up with a series of key features for the Pacific Resilience Partnership, and they include aspects of inclusiveness and human rights approach, the creation of a task force to be action-oriented and results-based, inclusive representation on the PRP task force, clear definition of what paradigm shift and Pacific leadership means, emphasis on strong ownership by countries and territories with the support of all stakeholders progressing the resilience agenda, the Pacific supported by a technical working group that are time-bound and results-based in key areas that are identified by the task force or the Pacific Resilience meeting, and a support unit operation that will be anchored in the free crop agencies with support drawn from other stakeholders. This is just a diagrammatic presentation. I thought after all that writing you deserve something in terms of to rest the eyes. But basically, each of the four groups identified in the FRDP, private sector, community, civil society, national, subnational governments, regional organisations and development partners come together through the Pacific Resilience meeting. The Pacific Resilience Task Force provides the means to be able to provide the implementation going forward and then to feed up to the Pacific leaders for the various meetings such as not only the Pacific Forum Leaders meeting but also the CRGA, SPREP Council and also other associated ministerial meetings of relevance. Just lastly, with regard to going forward for this process, now that we've had this process that was requested by leaders in terms of having a Pacific Resilience Partnership working group, we now have a series of a proposed governance arrangement going forward, and that's been finalised in conjunction with country and stakeholder comments. A paper will be going to my governing council for the Forum Secretariat, which is the Forum Officials Committee, where that will be considered in August. And if that is endorsed by the FOC, then it will go through to the leaders for their consideration and approval when they meet in September. We also have a paper going through to the SPC CRGA, which will be considered in July, and the SPREP Governing Council will meet in September. And as I said, we'll be seeking forum leaders' approval of that governance arrangements going forward. So again, I'd like to be able to thank you for your time. I hope that I've got us back on track for the timing so that our last presenter has some time to speak, and I look forward to any comments or questions you might have. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you, Scott, on presenting on a framework that integrates climate change and disaster risk into sustainable development for the Pacific. And I now move on to our next speaker, Kaya. Kaya is a practicing barrister. She attained her BA in Pacific Studies and Environmental Law from the University of Auckland. and her passion and specialization lies in environmental and climate change law, especially in respect to the Pacific. I give the floor to Kaya.
Nisa Bulavanaka, good afternoon to all of you here today, my fellow panelists, esteemed guests, our moderator, and colleagues. I'd like to thank the ADB, ANU, and USP for the opportunity to present this paper here today. So far you've heard from the economists and one engineer, so now you're going to have to hear from the lawyer. As you guys have been told, my name is Kaya. I'm a practicing barrister here in Suva at Lal Patel Bale Lawyers. And I'm really hoping that my title was relatively self-explanatory. So climate change has been overwhelmingly accepted by science and academics and the world as being real. And however ubiquitous this phenomenon may be, for the most part, the discourse has overwhelmingly been in respect to people who would be displaced by climate change, what is colloquially and often wrongly referred to as climate change refugees. So we know theoretically what happens to the people, but what happens to their land and ocean territories that they came from? So these days, especially in Fiji, it is very difficult to even walk out your front door without being bombarded by climate change rhetoric or information about COP23. And for our purposes, or for my purposes rather, the impacts of climate change and climate change-induced sea level rise fall within two categories: the long-term effects and the short-term effects, essentially. So long-term, we see the potential possibility that whole or parts of Pacific Islands may vanish, may sink. You know, this is the rhetoric that the media is portraying basically hysterically, predominantly due to inundation and excessive sea level rise. However, more concerningly for us would be the short-term effects. Climate change-induced sea level rise has the potential to render islands uninhabitable, which this is what poses the threat to Pacific Island sovereignty, to statehood, and to exclusive economic zones. As sea levels rise, they in turn cause greater coastal erosion and greater inundation, which subsequently results in a greater chance that the thin freshwater lenses on these islands are likely to be contaminated by saltwater. And as this happens, this will either destroy or contaminate the water sources, and in some cases, destroy the ability for islands to grow crops, whether for feed or for livestock. And once an island can no longer produce its own food or water, it essentially poses the threat of becoming uninhabitable. And in the Pacific, where along our coast we see the area of concentration of populations and infrastructure and resources, this short-term effect is probably an even bigger and more imminent threat than the long-term for us. So then what, because of this, what becomes the position of Pacific Islands, in law? So to answer these questions, we have to look at two major legal regimes. The first of which is the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and the Duties of the States from 1933. And as you can see behind me, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea from 1982, commonly referred to as UNCLOS. So under UNCLOS, a coastal state may claim from their baseline a territorial sea to 12 nautical miles, a contiguous zone to 24 nautical miles, an exclusive economic zone to 200 nautical miles, and then in the cases of some lucky states, they might also get to claim part of a continental shelf. And so all of these claims are measured by or underpinned by a system of baselines, which is established under UNCLOS. Baselines help us determine the limits to these territorial claims. And so for most states, the default measurement of a baseline is from what we call the low water mark. And the alternative to this, in some instances, is a straight baseline. And so you'd only use a straight baseline where you've got a bay or a fringe of islands or some indented piece of land where you need to connect the points in order to determine the measurement. Under UNCLOS Article 7, subsection 2, it deals with straight baselines for deltas or bays or any geographically unstable feature in land. And under Article 7, subsection 2, you are allowed to fix a baseline, meaning that that baseline, once set in stone, cannot move. And so this is the problem here. Because if the drafting intent behind that was to fix a baseline, they've explicitly gone and said that, which means all other baselines are ambulatory. They can move. Which means that as coastlines erode and as sea levels creep into islands, there is the potential that these baselines that we use to measure our land and sea territories will also creep landwards, will creep inwards, and increasingly shift and reduce in size as the size of land in which we measure them from is reduced. And this shift will also threaten our claimable territory, and specifically Pacific claims to our exclusive economic zones, as well as posing a threat to sovereignty and statehood. So within law, there is no singular definition for what a state is. There's no, you can't just look at, book A and it'll tell you. So instead, the international community essentially abides by the most commonly accepted definition, which, as I said or pointed to earlier, can be found under the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and the Duties of States. Under the Montevideo Convention, a state is deemed to be a person of international law who possesses the following characteristics or meets the following criteria. Essentially, they have to have a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Oop, wow, sorry, unfortunately my phone is deciding that it wants to get involved in the process as well. So as I was saying, the criteria is a permanent population, a defined territory, and a government and the ability to enter into relationships with states. So under the first criteria, a permanent population, it has been suggested that this just means that the population of a country cannot be transitory. It has to be a fixed amount of people. They can't come and go as they please. However, once again, because our international legal regime is so great, it doesn't define the amount of people it needs, to meet this criteria of being a permanent population. Instead, some have suggested that it just needs to be a big enough population to meet or to be a population nucleus. So you could have a few people staying behind. Some say the number could maybe be 50, and potentially the rest of the population could be a diaspora population, essentially acting as a legal anchor. However, the German courts have gone and qualified this population criterion, saying that any population that remains in a nation, in a state, has to have the characteristics of communal life. But once again, they didn't define what this actually means. For us, as Pacific Island states, probably the bigger issue is the defined territory. So within international law, the key formulaic element of a state is usually seen to be its territory, which with inundation, coastal erosion, and having low-lying islands, this disproportionately affects us. However, once again, there is no definition or no minimum requirement for the size of land or needed to meet this territorial requirement. And so there is the possibility that if some land remained, then we could still possibly generate or a claim to certain areas of ocean territory. However, in its worst case scenario, if nothing remained, this is where we're seeing some of the questions arise. Because there is an increasing push within the legal literature to encourage this territorial requirement to be a flexible one. So in the cases of governments in exiles, you would only need to have a territorial base of operations, somewhere to operate from, and this did not necessarily have to be within your own borders. And so the final two criteria, a government and the ability to enter into relations with other states, are often deemed to be the most flexible requirements out of the four. And it's pretty straightforward why this is. It's because over the centuries that a state has been considered a body in law, numerous states have failed at various points in time to either meet the government portion or to meet the retention, or fail to have the ability to enter into relations with other states. So for example, PNG, the Solomon Islands and Fiji, at any given point when they had a crisis, never ceased to be a state for the lack of an effective government. So under our current international framework then, putting this against one another, what does this actually mean? So if we were to take a strict legal reading then, then the Pacific Islands run the risk essentially of becoming reduced to what is described in law as rocks. This is because under Article 121 of UNCLOS, an island needs to be a naturally formed piece of land, which is above the water at high tide. And this piece of land then subsequently allows this generation of exclusive economic zones. If an island was reduced to a rock, then this reduces their claimable area from 15,500 square nautical miles to 452,000 square nautical miles. So this is a big difference for us. And the worst case scenario, submergence. In this situation, it's pretty clear. Islands are completely inundated or they sink because of sea level rise. If this is the case, they would be, under the current international legal framework, there is no claim. This area of land that was once Fiji or Tonga or Samoa, Tuvalu or Tokelau would then revert to being the high seas with no one having a claim for it and it being governed by international law. So the other options that we have are potentially conserving sovereignty through the inclusion of lighthouses or artificial conservation. So some have suggested within the literature building lighthouses on sinking islands essentially as a sovereignty marker. While theoretically this is really sounds great and there is precedence for it within the law, the issue is that under UNCLOS Article 60, these artificial conservations might be deemed exactly what they are, artificial conservations, and artificial installations cannot warrant the protection or creation of an exclusive economic zone and has no claimable area. So after this, we come to the possibility of baselines and boundaries and what we can do within them. So the first one would be to freeze baselines. So some have been pushing for the idea of freezing or fixing our current baselines where we have them currently. The only issue with this model to protect sovereignty would be, do we freeze our baselines from the inception of UNCLOS, from today, from 10 years from now? And it raises a very complicated interplay of law on how to actually do this. The fifth option is the Doctrine of Historic Waters. And so this is a doctrine within law that countries could possibly evoke to say that the area of land that the area of sea, that they have claimed stays with them. And in order to do this, they have to show that a country has had and maintained jurisdiction over this area of water, and that other countries agree to their claims. So for Pacific Islands, the issue here lies with showing that you have had an undisturbed possession of this water, considering how large our ocean areas are. And I was going to discuss masterly inactivity, but because I'm running far over time, I'm going to skim over it. Basically, masterly inactivity means you deposit your boundaries with the UNCLOS body or with the UN, and then you leave it and you do nothing. So inactivity is the emphasis there. So then basically, what are our options then under UNCLOS? So there is one untried version or option to take to retain boundaries and possession of claimable sea areas, where basically a country can propose a specific amendment to UNCLOS as a whole through a written communication to the UN Secretary General. However, this requires a 12-month process and half, which is 84 countries, to agree favorably to this specific amendment. The other option is through a simplified procedure where instead of convening a conference through a written communication, which you would do under the first option, you basically circulate your documents, and if one country says they don't like it, it's dead. That's it. So numerically, these pose quite challenging odds for us to actually be successful and do. So the other option is moving to a decision of the meeting of the parties of the Law of the Sea Convention, also rather cutely referred to as a SPLOS. And so this has been used before to amend UNCLOS. However, each time it was used to postpone elections or change submission times. It was purely procedural and never anything substantive, like including climate change in an already established legal regime. And so the third option is potentially using an agreement supplementary to UNCLOS. And so basically, these are agreements that aim at supplementing interpretation and implementation of UNCLOS and can be adopted and negotiated in various forms. This has only been done once, but it was successful. But once again, it was a procedural, textual changes, including new voting procedures. It was not a process of substantive body changes within the document. So finally, and very quickly, I know I've been, time is quite tight here, our other options are for sovereignty, retention of claimable areas for Pacific Islands within a world of a changing climate and rising sea levels, would be for the creation of a customary regional international law. And so this is basically a subsection of international law where a group of countries or basically get together and say that, yes, they agree that this is a custom, this is something that they've always done and they're continuing to do it. And one way to really build on this or to get it across the line would be for not only Pacific Island large ocean states, but for also large ocean states in the Caribbean or in the Indian Ocean to also say that, yes, these are our oceans and it's never changed, and help by abiding this creation of custom. And customary international law, regional international law, has shown great strength at being accepted within the international legal regime under both the International Law of the Sea Tribunal as well as the International Court of Justice. And in order to meet this, a country would basically just have to say that it is state practice and that they believe that their actions amount to law. So it's actually comparatively a very straightforward process, I personally think. Traditionally, though, it's been quite a slow process until now. We're seeing this greater acceptance by the international community to allow for the acceptance of a rapidly evolving customary regional international law, which for the Pacific is very good. It's a very good thing for climate change and a very good possibility for us for retaining these areas. The other one is judicialization, taking it to the courts, the International Tribunal on Law of the Sea, and getting them to decide, getting them to give us the answers for the spaces and the silences within the document. And finally, a new treaty. We could decide that we're going to create a whole new legal regime for dealing with climate change, induced sea level rise, and its impacts on boundaries. This could be a brand new treaty, or it could be something for UNCLOS or the UNFCCC. So very finally, like in the last 10 seconds, what is certain though, what is clear is that UNCLOS and our current system is very badly equipped to deal with this current problem, especially for Pacific states. And so it's clear that the Pacific Islands are facing a double harm prospect, where climate change will threaten or push us to lose our lands, and international law will threaten or completely remove our seas. So the question remains is, what option do we take and where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thank you, Kaya, and that's very enlightening understanding that our sovereignty at times is also based on international laws that we have to work to address and try to influence. You've been presented with 4 different aspects of climate change, adaptation, and resilience. I think it provides quite a good dialogue. And I now open the floor for questions, clarifications, or feedback from the audience. And you don't have to put up your hands all in one go. Oh, there's a question at the center there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. Aileen Power, I'm an independent researcher. Kaya, my question is actually around, given what's happening in the South China Sea and decisions around sovereignty and water, are there things we can learn in the Pacific around the reasons for those decisions being made?
So thank you, Hannah, for that question. I'm just going to apologize for how rushed that presentation might have seemed. Trying to cram 50 years to 100 years of international law into 15 minutes, especially when you're framing it against climate change, is always a challenge. The South China Sea actually is a very interesting case study. So for those of you who aren't aware, basically there's been some contention over how far sea boundaries extend basically between China and I think Japan, if I'm not mistaken, into the South China Sea. And basically China has attempted to shore up or demonstrate their claim by building artificial islands. And so what's very interesting is that under Article 60 of UNCLOS, artificial islands can be built within a country's exclusive economic zone, but they cannot generate their own claimable land territories. So for example, your furthest point on your map or of an island essentially, is where you would start measuring your exclusive economic zone or your territorial claims from. So you can, within your own area, build an artificial island and it's fine. But if you build it on the edge of your boundary and attempts to push out your exclusive economic zone, it doesn't work that way. And so with the South China Sea, what's very interesting is that previously, America had actually come out very openly and said that they denied China's claim through the use of artificial islands. But since the new Trump administration has come in, they've actually backtracked on that and is now supporting China's claim as a way to shore up an allyship over North Korea. So politically, this is quite interesting. Before, the United States, one of the largest bodies, was very adamant that artificial island zoning was not a thing that could be accepted to produce an exclusive economic zone. However, with their backtracking now and them openly coming out and saying yes, it could provide an interesting stepping stone or a wormhole to slowly start digging at the issue to increase the recognition of artificial islands, which for the Pacific, I know a number of islands have said that they were considering this. I think Tahiti recently was saying that they were considering it, and I think there have been some talk with some of the other islands about using artificial islands as means of conservation. So for us, it's actually a very good thing in the sense that it might allow our claims and the use of artificial means to get more gravitas, to be more realized.
One question from the gentleman at the center.
Thank you. The question is actually for probably one of you who can just respond. On the stand by the United States too on the Trump administration, and where will we, the Pacific, go to if a super nation who we look up to suddenly decides to look, we're not interested in this? How do we manage that? How do we mitigate that from small island economies? We know the issue with climate change. Perhaps the Americans don't. Then how do we deal with that? It's quite a worrying thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll allow the panelists to give their response. It might be their own personal views and on that, and I'll give it from the start from Tobagas all the way down to Kai. Thank you.
I think, regardless of what happened in the global development in terms of the climate change, the small islands in the Pacific will remain vulnerable to natural disasters anyway. So I think building economic resilience will still very important regardless of what happened in the world. So if let's say there is a cyclone coming in to one of the small islands in the Pacific, that will affect growth, that will affect on the fiscal. So the government will have to prepare. So again, my point is that preparing and building economic resilience, developing policies in which the country can have a good strategy in not only in reducing the impact or mitigating the impact, the negative impact of natural disasters in the short term, and also building more resilient economy in the longer term is always still relevant. So I think, and that point is something that we need to work on together, both the authorities and the development partners in developing the policies to build economic resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. The question sort of emphasises the significance of the US as an international player in the climate change discussion. I think we need to remember that the US is just one country. In all of these international treaties, we have many countries in the Pacific that are getting up and sharing their voice. If you're concerned about what this administration may or may not do with regard to their historic commitments with climate change, the US government under the previous administration has already given $1 billion to the Green Climate Fund, and the current administration has stood up and confirmed that they will continue with their current projects. So it might be a short-term absence from a leadership position, but in the future this will likely change, as with all democratic governments, and I think that countries like Fiji are proud, they're strong, they get up on the world and international stage and they promote their self-interests. And for me, I don't see there being a need for great concern.
Thanks very much for your question. I mean, I guess the thing is that obviously it's easy to be able to look at the decision with alarm, but I think the first point was when the United States President did make that announcement just over 3 weeks ago now, the specific details of what the US position was going to be in terms of its engagement with the Paris Agreement and what it was going to withdraw from is still quite vague. And so we're obviously awaiting more details with regard to what the specific US position will be as it goes forward, to enable us to be able to understand completely. Obviously, there was also an offer with regard to the US, obviously being interested in engaging in a new agreement. However, being part of the Paris Agreement and the negotiations for that, it was very hard as it was to be able to do that. But anyway, I think that's one aspect with regard to the fact is that we need to be able to wait for more clarification from the US, particularly the US State Department. I know that for the recent negotiations sessions that were occurred in Bonn in May, was that the US delegation didn't have clear instructions from their government. And so hopefully coming into the negotiations that will come as part of COP23 in Bonn in November, they'll have clearer instructions about how they're going to go forward. I guess the other thing too is that to look on the upside was that the US did not withdraw from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's very important because that means that if the US had withdrawn from that, then basically they would have withdrawn from the whole framework that has been pushing the whole process on negotiating not only the Paris Agreement, but the Kyoto Protocol, etc., and other work going forward. The other thing too is that the US provides 22% of the budget of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So again, by the US not withdrawing from UNFCCC, that indicates the US still remains engaged in the negotiations process as it goes forward. The other thing too is that obviously we need to be able to ensure that there is engagement. This is a global process, and as I said in my presentation, multilateralism had a series of important successes in 2014, 2015, 2016, particularly not only with the Paris Agreement, but also with the Sendai Framework, and also with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. This is not just purely about climate change, this is about development in general. The fact is that climate change, climate variability, disaster or natural hazards are cross-cutting, going across a range of sectors, providing development challenges for countries, rather than it means that it requires a holistic approach by all countries. The other thing too is that, as David already identified, US is funding, the United States government is already funding a series of climate change funding programs in the Pacific, most notably the US READY program and the ISAC program. These are ongoing and continue to indicate the US is engaged and continuing its involvement in the Pacific on climate change, particularly climate change finance, but climate change issues overall. The last matter is that the Pacific governments responded very quickly. Most leaders were in New York or heading to New York when that announcement was made, and as a consequence, the president of the Federated States of Micronesia, who's currently the forum chair, he made a press statement, press release statement, fairly strong statement about the importance of the United States remaining engaged and identifying the priority that climate change has for Pacific Island countries in the Pacific. And as I said in the presentation, it is one of the key priority areas within the Pacific and will remain so as we go forward. So again, I think the fact is that rather than seeing this as an immediate setback, it is a challenge, but it's something that we need to keep engaged with the United States and seeing the glasses half full rather than half empty when we're looking at the challenge as we seek to be able to ensure that the United States remains engaged on climate change. Thank you.
So I think it's very clear that Pacific Island leaders and Pacific Island nations who want to be heard on climate change are being heard and are taking the best interests of their people in quick stead on the international stage. I think what's more concerning, though, are for the Pacific Island nations that don't have a voice within the UNFCCC in light of the United States. So these would be the countries or states that have a very close relationship with the United States and as a result aren't recognized as countries or a constituent member of the UNFCCC. So for example, the federal states of Micronesia, they only representative at the table for any UNFCCC or climate events is the United States. So I think for them, the problem is with being locked out of these negotiations if the United States is acting or talking for them. I also think, Guam, Hawaii, they're also going to be disproportionately affected by climate change due to their topography and being islands. So there is also an issue there. I think the Pacific, though, has been shown that the world, and especially, like the EU, are willing to ally themselves with us. And it really strongly reminded the US that they are one out of 198.
So sorry to be very technical, but all Pacific Island countries, the 14 independent and self-governing states of the Pacific, are all signatories of the UNFCCC and also the Paris Agreement. But I think if you're talking about the non-government, but at the government level, the Federated States of Micronesia is represented. Yeah, they are. I've been a member of the delegation, and Palau, and also the Republic of the Marshall Islands. They are all represented at the national level at the negotiations.
Any more questions from the audience?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rabia, and I work for Fiji Commerce Commission. I have a question, and this is directed to David Fay, that's from PRIF. So, when we do infrastructure development, and it is near coastal areas, and there are certain, like mangroves are planted, and we have to remove them so that we can do a greater development. So do you have any suggestions as to how we can improve our coastal areas as well as improving infrastructure? As such, in Fiji, there's a development going in Vatwanga at the moment where the Stinson's Bridge is being upgraded. And for that to be upgraded, the coastal area around that has been removed. And so do you have any suggestions as to how coastal protection and infrastructure improvement can go hand in hand together? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. There is an extensive safeguards policy statement that the ADB has in place to ensure that if a project does result in the removal of sensitive environmental assets, then other measures must be put in place to make sure that the project overall returns the environment to a better than before project case. Obviously the removal of mangroves is avoidable, and we would look to change alignments. Preferably we would keep roads away from coastlines with the avoidance objective. But this is always a significant discussion. When a project officer is considering a loan, the first thing they need to do is to categorise a project, and when they come up to the board, there's always this question. So the bank goes to great lengths to try to mitigate damage and to leave the country in a better state post-project. And then there is always the tension that governments say, well, we need this infrastructure, this is critical to access, this is critical to job development and the advance of our society. So the question is a difficult one, and we address it on a project-by-project basis, and we have extended, sometimes often very painful processes to make sure that we do the job properly.
Thank you very much. I've been asked by the organizers to wrap up, and I would like to thank again the panelists for this session. They've provided us with quite a lot of information on different aspects of climate change adaptation and resilience. As the Bagas has outlined, we need to, at the country level, to look at our macroeconomic policies to ensure that climate change and disaster is mainstreamed in our policies. And as that includes also our assets, and as David has outlined, it's not about just building a seawall or road, it's about the quality, and it's also about incorporating the knowledge that is already there in terms of protection of our coastline. And as Scott has outlined, it's about partnership to ensuring that we maximize what is out there, what is happening now through our partnership with our different stakeholders, and that's not just development partners, it's also our stakeholders at the community level, the non-state actors, the private sector. And then there's also the issue about the global influences, what is out there, as Kaya has outlined, being coastal states and with the impact of climate change, existing international laws that dictate our sovereignty are things that need to be the discussions need to be ongoing in this respect. And I think the panelists have presented further food for thought for all of you out there, and they're here at this point in time. If you still want to discuss further with them, please come forward and get their contact details and everything like that. And again, please join me in showing our appreciation for the panelists for this session. Thank you very much. And this session is concluded, and I think Prince has some announcement.
Okay, thank you, Tia. Thank you for all the panelists. We can now have our afternoon tea, so the same tent outside. And then please come back after 30 minutes for the last parallel session for today. See you. Thank you very much.